The clock on the wall showed 6 in the evening, but for Mr. Henry, time had lost much of its meaning. At 78 years old, he lived in a modest house on the outskirts of a quiet little town. The walls held stories of the past, cloaked in an almost suffocating silence. Since his wife, Mrs. Margaret, had passed away years ago, loneliness had become his constant companion. Diagnosed with Alzheimer's 3 years earlier, fragments of his memory were slipping away, leaving him lost in a mix of days that blended together like pages in a shuffled book. That afternoon, the sky began to turn gray. Henry sat in his rocking chair in the living room, staring blankly ahead, trying to recall whether he'd had lunch or not. He clutched a faded photograph of Margaret, as he did every day, hoping some detail from the past would surface. But instead, a familiar discomfort crept in, the nagging feeling that something was forgotten, a part of himself slipping further out of reach. Outside, a gentle breeze rustled the fallen leaves in the yard. Henry stood up slowly and shuffled to the kitchen, opening the fridge without really knowing what he was looking for. That's when he heard it, a faint scratching at the front gate, accompanied by a low, persistent whimper. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice thin and uncertain, as if he wasn't expecting an answer. He approached the window, but his vision wasn't as sharp as it used to be. All he could make out was a shadow near the iron gate. For a moment, he thought it might just be the wind, or maybe another trick of his faltering memory. But then the sound came again, louder this time, stirring an unusual sense of curiosity in him. With shuffling steps, Henry headed to the door. His heart began to beat faster, not out of fear, but from a strange impulse to investigate. He opened the front door and looked toward the gate. Light rain had begun to fall, forming tiny puddles in the dirt. And there it was, a large dog with brown fur and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. It was a pit bull, clearly exhausted, its ribs visible and its breathing labored. The dog looked at Henry as if it knew this house was its last hope. "What do you want, huh?" Henry asked, half suspicious, half intrigued. The dog, of course, didn't reply. Instead, it lowered its head and let out a soft whimper, as if pleading. Henry stood there for a moment, staring at the animal while the rain grew heavier. Something in its gaze reminded him of himself, lost, alone, and unsure where to go. Without thinking too much, he unlocked the gate with trembling hands. "Come on in then, but no funny business, okay?" The pit bull hesitated for a second, as if unsure the invitation was real, but then it stepped through the gate, walking slowly toward the porch. Once inside, Henry got a closer look. The dog's snout bore scars, marks of a hard life on the streets. It looked as weary as Henry felt every day. "I don't know where you came from, but I don't have much to offer," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. Henry grabbed a piece of stale bread from the kitchen table and placed it on the floor. The pit bull devoured it in seconds, wagging its tail for the first time. At that moment, something shifted in the house. The silence, once stifling, was replaced by the sound of paws exploring the space. Henry, back in his rocking chair, watched with a mix of curiosity and a faint sense of ease. For the first time in a long while, the weight of his loneliness seemed lighter. Without quite knowing why, he smiled. "Looks like you're staying the night." The dog lay down at Henry's feet, as if it understood that in this modest house it might have found a safe haven. That night the rain fell harder, drumming on the roof with a rhythm that filled Henry's house with a melancholy yet comforting sound. The pit bull, now settled in a corner of the living room, remained quiet but kept its watchful eyes on the old man. It seemed to be studying Henry, as if trying to understand the man who, despite his frailty, had shown it a rare act of kindness. Henry, for his part, couldn't help but fall into the habit of talking to himself. Or perhaps he was starting to talk to the dog without realizing it. "I don't know where you came from, but it's clear you've had it rough," he said, while rummaging through a kitchen drawer, searching for something else to feed the animal. He found a piece of dried meat, hardly resembling fresh food, but it was all he had. The dog stood slowly when it noticed the food, wagging its tail timidly. Henry crouched down with effort and placed the meat on a small plate on the floor. "Go on, eat. Don't worry, I'm not taking it from you." The pit bull devoured the food hungrily, but not with the aggression Henry might have expected from a street dog. Instead, the animal seemed grateful, almost respectful. After finishing, it licked the plate clean and lay down again, this time a little closer to the old man. "You're smart, aren't you?" Henry remarked, settling back into his rocking chair. "And not too bad looking either." The warm glow from the lamp in the living room lit up the dog's face, revealing expressive eyes. There was something almost human in them, a sadness mixed with hope, as if it carried stories it couldn't tell. As the clock ticked on, Henry began to recall another dog from his younger days, a mutt named Sparky. Sparky had been his and Margaret's inseparable companion when they were young and full of dreams. But the memory soon slipped away, dissipating like smoke, leaving behind the emptiness that Alzheimer's always seemed to create. His name was, Henry started to say, but the words faded before he could finish. Sensing the old man's frustration, the pit bull lifted its head and rested its snout on his leg. It was a simple yet powerful gesture that silenced Henry and brought a faint smile to his face. "I think I'll call you Max," he said after a moment of thought. "A strong name for a strong dog." Max seemed to approve. He wagged his tail more enthusiastically this time, as if he knew the name now belonged to him. That night, when Henry headed to his bedroom, Max followed without hesitation. The old man left the door open and eased himself onto the bed, listening to the steady sound of the rain. Max, like a silent guardian, lay down beside the bed in a spot that seemed reserved for him all along. In the days that followed, Henry's routine began to change. Previously, he would spend hours sitting in his rocking chair, lost in fragmented thoughts and memories. Now, Max seemed to fill that void with purpose. The dog followed him around the house, barked softly to alert him when something seemed out of place, and even tried to get his attention when Henry forgot simple things, like leaving the kettle on the stove. One morning, as Henry struggled to remember if he had locked the gate, Max ran to the door and stood there, as if to say, "Don't worry, I've got this covered." Henry chuckled, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in a long time. "All right, big guy, you might be more responsible than me." But not every moment was peaceful. One particularly restless night, Henry woke up disoriented. He didn't recognize the bedroom and couldn't figure out where he was. Panic set in, and he began calling out random names, searching for something familiar. It was Max who brought him back. The dog jumped onto the bed and lay beside him, gently licking his hand. Henry, still trembling, felt the comforting warmth of the animal and gradually calmed down. "Thank you, boy," he whispered, before drifting back to sleep. As the days passed, Max proved to be more than just a loyal dog. He seemed to have a special sensitivity for detecting Henry's most vulnerable moments. When the old man stayed silent for too long or appeared lost in thought, Max would approach, rest his snout on Henry's hands, and pull him back to the present. "I think you're an angel in disguise, Max," Henry said during one of these moments. Although the dog couldn't understand the words, he seemed to grasp the sentiment behind them. He wagged his tail and stayed close, as if to say, "I'm here, you're not alone." Max's presence didn't just transform Henry's daily routine, it shifted how Henry saw himself. He had once felt like a burden to the world, a shadow of the man he used to be. Now, with Max at his side, he realized he still had something to give, even if it was just providing a home for a dog who had also endured a life full of scars. Days began to flow in a way Henry hadn't thought possible. The silence in his house, which once felt suffocating, was now filled with life. Max's paws echoed across the floor, and the sounds of his breathing or occasional barks filled the empty spaces of Henry's memory. The old man started to notice little habits in the dog. Max always slept with one ear raised, as if ready to guard the house, and he never ate without first looking at Henry's face, almost as though seeking permission. Henry, in turn, started to change. The memory lapses still happened, but Max became his anchor, a constant reminder that he wasn't alone. "You're making me work harder than I should, boy," Henry joked with a smile as he filled a bowl of water for Max. Max wagged his tail in response, as if aware that this work was what kept Henry more active and present. One morning, Henry decided to do something he hadn't done in months: go for a walk. The idea came when Max started pacing near the door, clearly eager to explore the world outside. Henry hesitated. He couldn't remember the last time he had ventured out alone, and the fear of getting lost held him back. But Max's persistence was almost impossible to resist. "All right, Max, let's see how you behave out there." With a makeshift leash fashioned from a piece of rope, the two stepped outside. The neighborhood was quiet, with the soft morning sun casting light on the houses and trees. Henry walked slowly, leaning on his cane, while Max led the way with steady steps. The few neighbors who saw them passed by curiously, intrigued by Henry's new companion. Mrs. Carter, who lived on the corner, waved with a smile. "What a beautiful dog, Mr. Henry. Where did he come from?" Henry paused for a moment, looking down at Max before answering. "I think he came from wherever I needed him to come from." Mrs. Carter, not fully understanding, just chuckled. "Looks like he's taking good care of you." Henry continued walking, and the conversation lingered in his mind. In a way, she was right. Since Max's arrival, the house wasn't just a place where he existed, it was a home. That night, something curious happened that caught Henry's attention. He was in the living room, fiddling with an old radio that refused to work, when Max started acting strangely. The dog's ears perked up, and he ran to the front door, barking in a tone Henry hadn't heard before. "What is it, boy?" Max wouldn't stop. He went to the window, looked outside, then returned to the door, barking as if trying to alert Henry to something important. With difficulty, Henry stood and made his way to the door. Outside, everything seemed calm. The street was deserted, illuminated only by the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows. Henry squinted, trying to see beyond the gate, but there was nothing there. "Maybe you're imagining things, Max, or maybe it's me." The dog, however, stayed on high alert, as though sensing something Henry couldn't perceive. He spent the entire night lying near the door, his ears attentive to every sound. In the days that followed, Max's behavior continued to surprise Henry. The dog seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense when the old man was confused or lost in thought. One afternoon, as Henry rummaged through a kitchen drawer, searching for something he couldn't remember, Max entered the room, nudged the drawer closed with his nose, and let out a low bark, as if to say, "It's okay, you don't need it right now." Henry laughed, feeling a kind of tenderness he hadn't experienced in years. "You really are something special, boy. I don't know what I did to deserve you." Their bond had grown into more than mere companionship. It had become something profound. Max wasn't just a pet. He was family, a lifeline for a man who, despite his outward strength, carried invisible scars in his heart. The night was silent as midnight passed, with only the wind rustling the trees to break the stillness. Henry lay in bed, but a sudden sharp pain in his chest jolted him awake. He tried to shift positions, but the pain only intensified, radiating down his left arm. Panic set in as he tried to call out, but his voice came out as little more than a weak whisper. Desperately, he tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't obey. The room spun around him, and his vision blurred. Before he could make sense of it, Henry collapsed beside the bed, unconscious before he hit the floor. Max, who had been sleeping in the corner of the room, immediately raised his head at the sound of the fall. He hurried over to Henry, sniffing him urgently. Sensing something was wrong, Max began barking loudly, trying to wake him, When that didn't work, the dog circled around him, growling softly, as though searching for a solution. Max dashed to the front door and tried to push it open with his nose, but it was locked. Frustrated, he returned to the bedroom and licked Henry's face, desperate to wake him. Still, the old man remained motionless. Max's eyes darted around the room, landing on the living room window. Racing back to it, he stood on his hind legs, looking outside at the quiet, dark street. He began scratching at the glass and barking even louder, as though willing someone to hear him. When no one responded, Max made a choice. Taking a few steps back, he launched himself at the window with all his strength. The sound of shattering glass echoed into the night. Small shards cut into Max's skin as he tumbled onto the ground outside. His front paw bled from a deeper cut, but the dog shook off the pain, focused entirely on his mission. Without hesitation, Max sprinted down the street, his injured paw leaving small trails of blood on the pavement. He knew exactly where to go. Mrs. Carter, the neighbor who always greeted them during walks, lived nearby. Max had memorized the scent and path to her house. When he reached her front door, Max began scratching and barking furiously. Inside, Mrs. Carter, who had just been getting ready for bed, jumped at the noise. "What on earth?" she muttered, clutching her chest. She walked to the door and peeked through the window, startled by what she saw. Max, covered in small cuts, fur matted with blood, clawing desperately at her door. "Max? What happened, boy?" Opening the door quickly, she knelt down to inspect him. Max didn't wait. He grabbed the hem of her robe with his teeth and tugged, looking back toward the street. "You want me to follow you?" she asked, realizing something was terribly wrong. Max barked once and took a few steps, turning back to make sure she was coming. Throwing on a coat and grabbing a flashlight, Mrs. Carter hurried after him. When they reached Henry's house, Mrs. Carter was alarmed to see shards of glass scattered on the ground. She followed Max inside, who led her straight to the bedroom. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, spotting Henry lying unconscious on the floor. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she checked for a pulse. It was faint, but there. "Hold on, Mr. Henry, you're going to be okay," she said, her voice trembling. Grabbing her phone, she quickly called for an ambulance. While waiting, she glanced at Max, who was sitting by Henry's side, licking his own wounded paw. "You're a hero, you know that? Without you, he wouldn't have had a chance." Minutes later, paramedics arrived and rushed Henry to the hospital. Mrs. Carter insisted on bringing Max along, despite the dog's visible exhaustion and injuries. The morning light streamed through the hospital window, casting a calm glow over the room. Inside, the tension was still palpable. Henry lay in a simple hospital bed, connected to monitors tracking his recovery. He had suffered a mild heart attack, but thanks to the quick actions of Mrs. Carter and, of course, Max, he had survived. Slowly, Henry opened his eyes, blinking under the harsh light. He felt the weight of exhaustion in his body, but it wasn't long before he noticed something that made his heart stir. Max was lying beside the bed, his injured paw now wrapped in a bandage. Mrs. Carter sat nearby in a chair, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the scene with a soft smile. "Good morning, Mr. Henry," she said. "I think you owe this guy here a big thank you." She gestured to Max. Henry turned his head to the dog, and for a moment words failed him. He remembered the darkness closing in, the muffled sound of Max's barking, and waking up in the hospital. He knew exactly why he was still alive. He did all this?" Henry asked weakly. Mrs. Carter nodded, wiping away a stray tear. "He broke through the window to get help, ran straight to my door, bleeding and barking. He wouldn't stop until I followed him. He saved your life." With trembling hands, Henry reached out to Max, who sniffed him gently before giving his hand a soft lick. "You're an angel, boy. A real angel." Max wagged his tail, though his exhaustion was evident. The bandaged paw served as a reminder of the sacrifice he had made. The days that followed were about healing for both Henry and Max. While Henry remained in the hospital under careful observation, doctors emphasized the need for him to take better care of himself. "That was a close call, Mr. Henry. You need to take your medication properly, eat better, and stay active," one doctor advised. Henry nodded, but deep down, he knew the real reason he was still here. Max had given him something no medicine could provide: a second chance. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter took Max to the local vet, where he was treated for his cuts and injuries. She made sure he was well cared for while Henry recovered, and even brought Max to visit him at the hospital, much to the delight of the nurses. When Henry finally returned home, Max was waiting for him on the porch, his bandaged paw slightly lifted, but full of energy. The reunion was emotional. Max bounded toward him, circling his legs with such enthusiasm that Henry nearly lost his balance. "Easy there, boy, easy," Henry said, laughing, a sound that had become more frequent in recent days. Their bond was now unbreakable. Henry no longer saw Max as just a dog. He was family, protector, and a constant reminder that life could still hold meaning. In the weeks that followed, Henry's life underwent a transformation. He developed new routines, starting each day with a walk alongside Max. These walks not only helped improve Henry's physical health, but also became a cherished ritual for both of them. More than that, Henry began taking better care of himself overall. He took his medication on time, ate balanced meals, and even interacted more with his neighbors. Max, with his natural charisma, became a magnet for attention, and soon Henry found himself chatting with people more than he ever had before. Max's wounds healed quickly, though the scars remained, a reminder of the courage he had shown. The story of how Max had saved Henry's life spread through the neighborhood, turning them into local heroes. One afternoon, as Henry sat on the porch stroking Max's fur, he noticed something he hadn't before: a small mark on the dog's ear. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was a faint tattoo, the kind used by shelters to identify rescued animals. Curious, he mentioned it to Mrs. Carter, who suggested they visit the local animal shelter to investigate. At the shelter, a staff member examined the mark and found a record in their database. Max had been rescued years ago from an illegal dogfighting ring, but had escaped before he could be adopted. "This dog's been through so much," the shelter worker said, "but despite everything, he's still gentle and loyal. That's rare." Henry remained silent, his eyes fixed on Max. The scars, the strength, the unwavering loyalty. It all made sense now. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, boy?" Henry said softly. "But I promise, you'll never go through anything like that again." Max seemed to understand. He rested his head on Henry's lap, his eyes filled with trust and gratitude. The days that followed were a time of renewal for both Henry and Max. The house, once a place of quiet despair, now brimmed with life. The neighbors, touched by the story of Max's heroism, began to see Henry in a new light. No longer was he just the old man at the end of the street. He was now the man who, with his incredible dog, had captured their admiration. On a sunny morning, Henry sat on the porch with Max lying at his feet, his paw finally healed. The dog's eyes scanned the yard, always alert, as though still on a mission to protect his home. Henry held a warm cup of coffee, savoring the peace of the moment. Mrs. Carter appeared, carrying a basket of fresh fruit. "How are my two heroes today?" she asked, smiling. Henry chuckled, a sound that had become second nature. "We're doing just fine, thanks to you, and of course to Max." Mrs. Carter sat beside him, and Max wagged his tail, sniffing the basket before settling back down. "You know, Mr. Henry," she said, "what happened that night reminded us all that it's never too late for a fresh start. Sometimes life sends us angels in unexpected forms, like Max here, to show us we still have so much to give and receive." Henry nodded, looking at Max with a sense of deep gratitude. "He's given me more than that," Henry said. "He's given me a reason to keep going." From that day on, Henry vowed to never let Alzheimer's or loneliness dictate his life again. With Mrs. Carter's encouragement and Max's unwavering presence, he embraced his new routines. Each morning began with a walk, even if it was just around the block. Henry also started joining neighborhood gatherings, something he hadn't done in years. Max, ever the charismatic companion, became the star of every interaction, winning over everyone he met. His scars and story made him a symbol of resilience and loyalty. One evening, as Henry sat on the porch with Max resting beside him, he felt the need to speak. His voice was soft, as if the words were meant just for the dog. "You know, Max, you've taught me something I'd forgotten. Even in the hardest moments when everything feels lost, there's always a chance to start over." Max lifted his head, meeting Henry's gaze with those soulful eyes that seemed to understand more than words could express. His tail wagged gently, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. Henry smiled and looked up at the stars. For the first time in years, he felt whole. No matter what the future held, he knew that with Max by his side, he could face any challenge with courage and hope. The house, once a refuge of sorrow, was now a home filled with purpose and meaning. And with Max as his steadfast companion, each day became a new opportunity to rediscover the beauty in life's small moments.